Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to Realising First Nations Leadership and Basin Management. My name is Professor Troy Meston. I'm a Yalii and Gomeroi man, and I lead the First Nations research program in the One Basin CRC. I'll introduce our panel shortly, but today I'll be joined by members of our First Nations research program, along with the CRC's First Nations Applied Management Advisory Committee. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands and waters from which we meet today. Across the Murray-Darling Basin, there are many nations whose countries are connected through these river systems, each with their own laws, governance traditions, knowledge systems, and enduring responsibilities to care for land and water. We pay our respects to elders. We pay our respect to elders past and present, and we acknowledge the nations represented here today on our panel. We recognise the cultural authority, the leadership and the lived expertise First Nations people bring to discussions concerning water, country and the future of the basin. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from Meanjin, Brisbane, on the lands of the Yugara and Turrbal peoples. The One Basin CRC is an industry and research collaboration established to tackle significant and complex water-related challenges across the Murray-Darling Basin. We bring together more than 85 organisations spanning industry, government, research and community. A range of our partners can be seen on our screen today. A few quick housekeeping items before we get into today's session. We encourage questions. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions throughout the session, and we'll address these at the end if we have time. Secondly, today's session is being recorded. The recording, along with the recordings of all the other panel sessions we've held in response to the discussion paper release by the MDBA, will be available on the One Basin Review Hub and you can find that on our website in the coming weeks. So today our discussion focuses on the defining governance question facing the Murray-Darling Basin, and that is how the future of basin management can move beyond consultation and towards genuine recognition of First Nations leadership, authority, and enduring responsibilities to country. We meet an important policy moment, coinciding with the release of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority's Basin Plan Review discussion paper. Across the basin, more than 50 First Nations retain unextinguished sovereignty and continuing custodial obligations to water country. Yet formal authority over basin waters remains concentrated within state and statutory institutions. For First Nations people, water is not merely a resource or a commodity. It is life, it is law, it is economy, gives us our identity, functions as a connector between our kinship, and functions to allow us the continuity of intergenerational cultural transmission. When nations are excluded from authority over water and country, the consequences are tangible. We experience these consequences through environmental decline. We see weakened cultural continuity. We see reduced economic opportunities for our people across the basin, and we see on-the-ground, grassroots, community-level harm. Today's panel brings together leading voices in governance, rights, policy, economics, and engagement to examine the central question, which is, can this current reform moment advance genuine First Nations authority in basin management, or, critically, will it reproduce the limits of earlier reform cycles? Before I turn to our panel, I want to name 4 enduring tensions visible across basin governance from what we've seen so far in our work across the basin. First, we see that First Nations sovereignty persists, but authority has not followed with it. Second, we see First Nations recognition has expanded while power of authority has narrowed. Third, we see First Nations participation has too often been structured as advice rather than authority. And fourth, climate risk is intensifying while First Nations governance and authority and leadership remains peripheral to the system at large. These tensions raise the central question for today, which is basin reform prepared to move beyond consultation and towards shared authority? I'd like to invite our panel members now to introduce themselves. So I'll start with you first, Uncle Dale. Could I call you to introduce yourself and let people know where you're from?
Yo, Yama. My name's Dale Kerwin. I'm from the Wurundjeri Nation, and my dad was Wurundjeri and my mum was Wiradjuri. I was basically almost a stolen generation because I was born to 2 black parents. I grew up in the back of a car, learning all about culture, driving from Melbourne up to the Queensland border, staying with relatives and old uncles and aunties. Learn about this country and how important it is to us as people. My grandfather, Charles Lester Leon, who started NAIDOC Week, Errol Flynn was his patron. And Granddad used to say to us, Errol didn't walk in front of me, he didn't walk behind me, he walked with me. And I'd like to say there are a lot of non-Indigenous people that are walking with us today as well for caring of this country. Okay.
Thanks, Uncle Dale. Thanks, Uncle Dale. Could I call on Dr. Madeline Pugin now to introduce yourself, and Maddie?
Hi everyone, my name is Madeline Pugin. I'm a proud Kumba woman from the Gold Coast. I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow in Indigenous politics based within the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University, and I'm involved in the One Basin First Nations Applied Management Advisory Committee, and my expertise relates to Indigenous human rights. Looking forward to today's yarn.
Thank you, Maddie. Dr. Julie Barngary, could I call on you next?
Thanks, Troy. Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Julie Balangari. I'm a Goulburn Dungari woman from the mid-north coast. I'm currently on Yagara and Turrbal land in Meanjin. I'm a senior research fellow with One Basin in the First Nations researching program, and this is my second day today, but I've had a lot of involvement with FINAMAC prior to this. My dad was born or grew up on the mid-north Wales on the Barraville mission, and moved around a lot because he was born in 1948. So he moved around a lot so that they didn't get taken and become part of the stolen generations. My great-grandmother lived to be 117 years old, and she saw the first colonists come through the Nambucca, Scott's Head, Worrell Creek area, and died in 1975. That knowledge was passed on to my father and passed on to me myself. So I have a lot of older traditional knowledge that has been passed on and shared. I currently reside in Biripi country in New South Wales and have a focus on Indigenous policy and policy systems, systems reform and system change.
Thank you so much, Julie. Could I call on you now, Samantha? Calling Dr. Samantha Coombs to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, excited to be here today. I'm Dr. Samantha Coombs. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Queensland in the Business School, but more importantly, I'm a Nunakal Quandamooka woman from Minjarrabah, North Stradbroke Island. My research to date is really focusing on our ways of knowing, being and doing and how we can use that in business, particularly in the disability sector. And that's where my interest is at the moment, to build both inclusive and sustainable systems. Looking forward to chatting with everyone today and hopefully answering some questions. Thanks, Troy.
Thanks, Sam. Hey, Jeff, could I call on you now, Jeff, to introduce yourself?
Yama, I'm a proud Gomeroi man. I'm currently living and working and coming to you today from Guyabal, Jaiwa country of the Greater Western Waka Waka Nation near Toowoomba. My role in the One Basin CRC is the First Nations Engagement Lead. Looking forward to today and having a yarn.
So thank you. So that you've met our panel for the first time. So we please encourage all of the people who are online with us today to be able to send through some questions. I'm sure that there'll be some fascinating questions posed by those in the audience. So we're looking forward to fielding those from you as we proceed ahead. All right, so let's get into our webinar for today, or the substantive component of the webinar. In order for us to be able to understand basin governance, it's critical to be able to understand the deeper political foundations that lie at the heart of this conversation. So questions of water governance are never only technical. They're questions that intersect across law, across sovereignty, across authority, and most importantly, whose system is recognised and whose system is not recognised. So from that standpoint, could I call on Uncle Dale? I'll pose the first question to you, Uncle. In the early Basin Plan period, First Nations organisations articulated governance and jurisdictional claims. How were these claims translated or diminished within the Basin law and the institutions that operated that law?
Okay, well, look, I'll start with that the recognition of our, in the current structural frameworks of the legislations and policies needs to be changed. They don't recognise our cultural, spiritual and our legal justification for managing country and the waterways. We as the First Nations have expressed our concerns about our cultural rights to country and water as the First Nations of this country. There are over 350 Aboriginal nations, and we're not able to manage. 1% of the water is we have, just 1%. And again, how it's managed is questionable. Our claims for governance and jurisdictional responsibility have not been considered in water laws. You know, even water laws are different from land laws. Yes, we're being recognised with native title and land rights, but again, that doesn't recognise water. and our rights to water and economic rights. These institutional arrangements need to be changed. This jurisdictional ignorance has denied our rights and ability to practice culture and manage the waterways and the resources. We are underrepresented, and there are little rights for water management. We want our rights based in law and governance models so that our cultural values and cultural priorities for integration into the legal structures and laws is regarded. And look, we're talking about cultural waters, but within all the stuff that I've been reading, it's all about environmental water and who gets those rights. Okay, so yeah, there's no respect for us and the way we manage country. I've had huge concerns from growing up on country, the loss of our flora and fauna. Australia has the worst record in the world for destruction of flora and fauna in this country, in the world. And there's still very little concern how that's managed. Okay, yep. Do you
Thank you,
like
Uncle
that?
Dale. Yeah, no, thank you, Uncle A. That sets the foundation for us, and what we heard really clearly from your expression there is that our people and our ways have not been recognised and have not been acknowledged across all of the countries, and particularly across the Murray-Darling Basin system. So we'll go to local or national policy in a moment with Julie, but before we go to the national perspective, I want to bring in Maddie, who has expertise across international policy, particularly the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. So, Maddie, can I ask you a question? From an UNDRIP perspective, what obligations should governments adhere to when sort of making decisions about First Nations waters, our country, and our cultural futures?
Thanks, Troy. I'll begin by briefly explaining first what UNDRIP is. So it is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it is the most comprehensive international tool on Indigenous human rights. And what's really special about the Declaration is that it focuses on collective rights of Indigenous peoples. And underpinning those collective rights is the right to self-determination. And when we say self-determination, we mean that is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples controlling their own destinies, including their economic, social, and cultural development. So within the context of today's webinar, that means Aboriginal communities having access to water and river systems that we have deep cultural connections to and responsibilities for. So we're looking at UNDRIP, Article 25 clearly outlines these rights. And in terms of obligations that should be guiding governments, firstly, I believe relationship building with our people is crucial, and viewing us as key rights holders. We must be working in genuine partnership with them, and to do that in practice does take a real commitment to resourcing that facilitation of relationship building, of empowering communities. It's having cultural flows reflected in law and policy. It's having communities included as active authorities rather than being sidelined or included in superficial ways. A point I would really like to stress is that we shouldn't be consulted. It must be in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and it's very obvious when it's the former rather than the latter.
Maddie, that was excellent. Could I ask a further question before I turn to Julie? It's very clear from the international perspective, particularly from what UNDRIP tells us with the article that you sort of mentioned there, that there's direct advice to governments in relation to how to better deal with First Nations people in their jurisdictional boundaries. Could I ask a question? What was it Australia's relationship to UNDRIP? Were we slow to sign? Did we turn towards that statement pretty quickly, or just give us a bit of background?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Australia was a persistent objector to UNDRIP, and when it was endorsed in 2007, Australia formed a part of the group, what we call Kansas, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, who chose not to endorse the declaration. They did, however, change their position under the Rudd government in 2009, but in terms of normalising and socialising UNDRIP domestically within Australia, we are lagging behind other countries.
Thanks, Maddie, for that context there. Jules, in terms of normalising recommendations made from UNDRIP in the national policy landscape, can I ask you a question? From a policy systems perspective, what institutional dynamics have constrained First Nations decision-making power across water, across country, across the basin?
Yeah, so I think that from a policy systems perspective, the constraints on decision making for First Nations people can be understood across two key dimensions: institutional structures and policy communities. But there's also two other very big elephants in the room that shape those as well, which is the political realm and the historical contingency of colonialism. So to be able to understand how institutional structures operate and how those policy communities sort of orbit around those institutional structures, we really have to be cognizant of the political dynamics, particularly what is favourable, what the political interests are, the paradigm in which we sit in, such as neoliberalism, and what are the main outcomes that are meant to be produced from this. Colonialism also plays a huge role in understanding why we have been excluded for so long. And if you don't understand the very basics of colonialism and how it's set to exclude us and eradicate us, you can't understand why structures also exclude us. It wasn't until 1967 in the referendum where the idea of including us and the idea of self-determination in the early 1970s came to play. And these things then tried to absorb us into it. So at a really broad level, these things have shaped path dependencies in how governments and systems operate. And so decision-making then obviously remains with governments or authorities, which are usually government entities, to sort of move this forth. And so this long-standing institutional logic positions them as a primary decision maker, where First Nations people are usually typically engaged as stakeholders and through consultation processes, which are often really tokenistic. There's a great theoretical model called Einstein's ladder, which sort of really helps to break that down about where you should be. And unfortunately, what we see is a lot of decision making or partnerships, which are sometimes used coming from a really tokenistic low level on Einstein's ladder. So whilst this is concentrated, there is also, when we think about the political and the colonial history and legacies, or the hangover of that, is that legal and constitutional settings aren't recognising sovereignty, and it produces enforceable decision-making power to these governments or these entities, whereas we see differences in treaty-based systems where there might be First Nations authority to formally recognise and embed these decisions into decision-making structures. And so the other part I was talking to was the policy communities and how they orbit around these structures. So they play a critical role. Often governments are central to these policy communities. They can remain open, closed in how these networks operate and how they influence. And often First Nations people are included in these policy communities, but are far out of orbit rather than close to the action or brought in for certain things. And it means that whilst First Nations voices may be seen to be included, inclusion doesn't equal authority, and so we don't see voices being utilised to their full extent, and so we see decision-making power not fully shared, and so there remains a structural constraint there.
Thanks, Jules. Appreciate that comprehensive response. We'll come back to you, no doubt, throughout the course of this webinar. As I mentioned in the opening monologue that I presented to this webinar today, is that water is inseparable for our people. We don't see it as a commodity to be traded. However, what I've fast learned from my short time within the water space over the last couple of years is how much the broader industry and government actually see water as an economic commodity to be traded and bartered across the system. This is very foreign to us as Aboriginal peoples. Could I turn to you now, Sam, with a question specifically related to the economic impact of non-access to governance of water for our people. So, from your perspective, how has limited water authority shaped our ability to be able to participate in economic economies across the basin?
Well, I suppose the historical context has set it up so that Indigenous First Nations group along the Murray-Darling have been sitting outside of the systems that actually generate economic value from water in the Murray-Darling. The water really underpins really profitable agricultural, environmental, and trading markets, but these systems were all established and built and put in place without recognizing any kind of Indigenous jurisdiction and it's created this weird dynamic, this structural separation between the idea of custodianship and economic benefit. And they seem to be sitting in different camps at the moment in the Murray-Darling, which I think is what Troy was getting to. Just to sort of dumb it down a little bit, I could talk academic with you all until the cows come home, but just to keep it real clear, when you're playing a game of Monopoly, and I'm fairly certain everyone here has played a game of Monopoly, but we've got people that have gone around that board 250 times while other people were either sitting in jail or not allowed to participate in that game. So if you can think about someone going around a board 250 times on Monopoly, there's not a lot of real estate or resources left for the people that are then joining the game later on. So when we talk about that history and the history of this economic participation, we've been set up in a deficit, and we're still in that deficit now. Yeah.
Such a good analogy. Thanks, Sam. That was
Monopoly.
excellent. I love it, eh? Jeff.
It's a lesson in capitalism, that's for sure. I think Uncle Dale's got his hand up.
And easy for us to grasp onto as well. Well, most of us sitting in jail. Jeff, could I go to you before we turn to Uncle Dale quickly and just ask a quick question just from your perspective? Jeff works with us in the First Nations program, and he's at the coalface of engagement with nations right across the basin. So he has a grassroots on the ground perspective of some of the tangible impacts for nations in and around water. So Jeff, from the work that you've done across the CRC in your time that you've been with us, how would you describe the position of basin nations relative to their ability to make decisions over water?
Yeah, thanks, Troy. In the work we've been doing, it's been pretty consistent from nations that they still feel on the outside of basin decision making. There are items where we're engaged, but not really embedded in a way that reflects genuine shared decision making. A big part of this is the sense of ongoing marginalisation. So nations talk about their rights not being fully recognised, and their influence over water and environmental decisions is still quite limited. And that's despite being the traditional owners of the lands and waters. This is also a real frustration around experiencing the impacts without having the authority to influence them. Communities are seeing declining river health, water quality issues, and reduced access to water for cultural practices, but they don't always have a strong say in the decisions driving those outcomes. That disconnect comes up a lot. We're also hearing that engagement often feels more like consultation than partnership. It does happen, but it's not. It can't be inconsistent. And is often tied to specific points in time, like early planning rather than being ongoing. So it doesn't always lead to real involvement in decision making over the long term. That said, it's not all static. There are some positive shifts, particularly in place where nations are more involved in environmental water management. But overall, the feedback is that progress is still slow and not happening at the pace or scale that it needs. If nations are genuinely involved, the outcomes would be better for community and for the environment. Well, that is the hope. But stepping back, the overall picture nations describe is still one of being on the edge of decision making with some movement in the right direction, but a long way to get to the true partnership and shared authority. That's what I've been seeing, Troy.
Excellent, Jeff. And from the amount of travel that Jeff and I have done across the basin over the last 18 months or so, whenever community find out that our primary business is around water before we get to talk about any sort of project or any sort of like future aspirations. We first engage in very, very lengthy, in-depth conversations in around like water inequality, access to water, inability to be able to access, even just quality drinking water. So that the issues for community on the ground are very real. And I think we have an opportunity now with the Basin Plan review forthcoming, an opportunity to be able to shift the dial in and around basic essential services, but also ensuring that Aboriginal people have a right and a seat at the table in terms of governance and leadership. All right, so you've heard from our panel. For all of those who are joining us live today, could I ask that if there's anything pressing, any questions that you'd like to direct to any panel members, please share it through the Q&A. That would love to take questions and make this sort of a collaborative discussion as we move ahead. So if there's anything that's pressing or anything that you want to ask specifically to one of our panel members, we welcome that opportunity to be able to engage with those who are joining us today. Uncle Dale, you've got your hand raised. You had a comment to make in response to one of the statements of our panel members. Could I call you to talk now, Uncle?
Yep, thank you. Basically, it's about economics. I was fortunate enough in the 90s to work with Mr. Bonner when he was in the Queensland government. And again, when we talk about economics, we look at out in regional areas the amount of incarcerations. We have Black Deaths in Custody report that's out there, but we have, and I worked with Mr. Bonner on that, but we have out here in regional areas the incarceration rates. So as First Nations people, we have higher incarceration rates than non-Indigenous Australians. Also, and I'll give you an example, in the 60s when we were travelling around country, picking fruit and that, a drought hit. Now what happened was there was no water, I couldn't wash, Mum couldn't wash her clothes, I got scabies, all the kids around me, non-Indigenous kids around me picked on me and called me a germ and so on. And what happened, Mum and Dad would fight and there was no money to buy food. And if you look at that today, the economics today, there's incarceration rates, there's more homeless women with kids out there, as well as non-Indigenous, our mob and non-Indigenous. We can't put kids into sport. How can we afford to even send them to school when you look at? And we've got no rights in water management or water economics. We should be allowed to start our own ways of living in this environment. And non-Indigenous people come along with us with that too. They see it, and basically that's it. You have a look at this whole statistics on our culture. And we've had this since invasion. We had what they called missions. They were actually concentration camps, and that's not recognised. We weren't allowed to speak our languages. We weren't allowed to practice culture. Kids were taken away, and that's still happening today. We have more kids taken away from families than non-Indigenous. Anyway, I thought I'd just put that on the table. We're at that point. There needs to be something done. When drought hits, that last drought that hit, government gave farmers how much money? And yet how much of that went to local communities to support the poor people? Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Uncle Dale. I might turn to Julie just very quickly. We've been looking at some research in the past couple of weeks and some research to come out of Flinders University in South Australia related to the impact of drought and extreme weather events and the grassroots impact upon communities. Jules, you want to talk to some of those articles that we've looked at recently?
Sure. So I guess there's a number of things here, and it touches on what Uncle Dale was talking about, is that it's not just about the management of water, it's about all of the social detriments that come from it as well. A part of my research is around gender and the praxis between gender, conflict, instability, insecurity, and climate, and water plays a huge role in this. And so we see a lot of correlation between the impacts of the environment on people's everyday lives, which leads to insecurity and instability. And they have flow-on effects into other areas of policy. So things like ending domestic violence in communities and things like that has a heavy link to the climate and environment, and how these are dealt with. And if they're not seen as working in tandem with each other, often they are isolated and siloed and not seen how they interact. So there are a lot of flow-on effects from water insecurity or water not being managed well, and the flow-on effects in that. And they can range from gender justice for women, for First Nations women. First Nations women are the most marginalised in every situation, in every sort of area. And this isn't just in Australia, it's also in our region, in our Pacific, in Asia as well.
Appreciated, Jules. What I'll do is we'll turn to panel-wide questions in a second. We'll start to think, for the remaining time that we have left, start to think about some sort of solutions of how to properly respond to the moment that's presented by the Basin Plan review. But before I do, I noticed that in the chat, from Rosalind Best, comment comes through: I'm planning on submitting a Human Rights Commission complaint for inadequate consultation on ongoing engagement for the Gold Coast and Logan Basin water plans. I've provided a Gold Coast water plan submission, and in the process of completing a Logan Basin submission for traditional owners. Do you think, so this is a question to the panel, do you think this is beneficial? Do you have any suggestions or contacts who would be willing to assist in this space? Does anyone from the panel want to jump in terms of, is it beneficial to be able to take this course of action? Uncle Dale or Sam?
Yes, I believe there needs to be a course of action, and that's just one of them. I think there needs to be huge protests, people just not engaging in organisations that support our disengagement. We need to be able to sit down, not have fights and things, but sit down and show that there's a huge support for these rights. And how that's done is quite questionable. We can get out and walk 1,000 miles flying the flag and protesting, or we can just sit down in local areas and have a mass gathering to do it.
Excellent, Uncle. Happy to have those conversations offline as well. Rosalind, if you want to get in contact with any of the panel members, more than happy to facilitate the introductions or even have the conversation ourselves. Got a question come through from Frederick. How could the transfer of water licenses at Minjerribah to QVAC for a partnership with the Queensland Government provide lessons for the Murray-Darling Basin? Sam, that's your country.
That is my country. I do not get involved in native title, though. That's my Annie Valerie, my dad's sister. She's all in that kayak business. I think that the dynamic and this is the problem, right? Like Uncle Dale was saying, there's a lot of vox and there's a lot of difference between our groups. Quandamooka is a saltwater country with very little, well, I suppose we have the 18-mile swamp at the back of it where they historically pumped a lot of water off the island for Brisbane, a lot of the fresh water. But Stradbroke has a very different colonial history and experience of colonisation to the Murray-Darling context. So for us on Minjerribah, we actually got equal wages, for instance, about 20 years before the Wave Hill walk-off. So we had already gotten equal wages on the island at that point. There's stories of people coming to Minjerribah, first visitors to Minjerribah, and they were saying things like our people could already speak English at that time as well. And we also had a long period where a mission got shut down, so we were self-governed in that really strong assimilative mission and mission period where the people like Uncle was talking about. So on Stradbroke, on Minjerribah, those missions actually got shut down and we got to govern things for a long time. So the dynamic on Minjerribah is very different to what is on Finnamac. In the Fitzroy Basin area. But having said that, I suppose the lesson that can be learned is that it can be done and that Indigenous people are capable of managing resources effectively, efficiently, and also making money off that without harming country. So these things can coexist. When I said to you before that there was a separation between economic benefits and custodianship, when we look at Minjerribah, we know that that separation is artificial and they can actually be brought together to create sustainable incomes and economies. Thanks, Troy. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the questions coming in as well. Got one more here from John, asking similar to cultural flows in the Murray-Darling Basin, Murray-Darling, the Lake Eyre Basin, framing of cultural flow is around cultural practice, spiritual, environmental, and social. What are the panelists' thoughts of economic benefits being realised through reinvigoration/realisation of ancient trading routes as a key enabler of community-led and place-based change? Can we weave water-reed baskets of policy and legislative change start with a water movement of change? I'll direct that to Uncle Dale. If you don't know about Uncle Dale,
could I just jump in, Troy, real quick and answer that top bit of it?
Of course, yeah, please.
Sorry, I'll let you guys go with it, but I think the idea of reinvigoration or realisation of ancient trading routes, I mean, that's something that's already been discussed in other areas that I'm aware of. But the issue is that the colonial context in which we now exist has altered those routes. So we don't actually have access to all of them, and they're not in the same healthy way that they would be when they were being used before. So to reinvigorate them would be a massive thing. It'd be great, but whether it's actually feasible in the current dynamic and context based on colonialism and its impact, I'm not sure if it's possible. Yeah.
Such a good qualifier as well, Sam. No, I was going to turn to Uncle Dale because he did his first PhD on our trading routes and trading ways. Uncle Dale.
Yes, and that's been published as a book out there in the public domain. One of the problems we've got is our trading ways now are the major highways. And so they're all bitumened and cities are all around them. But however, I believe that we still can organise trade between our mobs. And that would include the towns along the ways as well, where we used to meet to do our meeting places and trade and business. You know, we see it in the Bunya Mountains there. We see it all over, all along the Great Dividing Range where our roads were. They're now horse tracks or cattle ways, cattle tracks and so on. There is the ability, though, to recreate those marketplaces. I see non-Indigenous people do it on weekends in towns selling veggies. You know, they're the veggies shops or whatever, veggie markets. They have in the showgrounds, once a month markets. We should be able to do the same. We have, and as well, we have the knowledge. That's one of the things that gets me. You go into the supermarket, what's Indigenous in there for sale? What's here as a native food here? Yeah, you'll see kangaroo, and that's about it. However, we have cotton, we have Mitchell grass, 10th most nutritional crop in the world, and yet we grow it as cattle fodder. But instead of making wheat bix or cereal out of it, we added flowers. Our ovens were the ant mounds. We dug them out and cooked in them, and so on. So there is that there, and we need to get on board and do it. We need to come together as mobs and recreate those trading paths and trading marketplaces. Anyway, it's
Thank you, Uncle Dale.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and you've probably given us a good segue to start thinking about sort of advice for the audience and those who engage with the webinar sort of moving forward. So I'll pose a question to Maddie. I'll ask Maddie to respond and then bring Julian for this and then open up to the rest of the panel. So thinking ahead, we're currently in this moment of the Basin, Murray-Darling Basin Authority's Basin Plan Review. And from what Maddie's only been exposed to water for a very short time so far, but from your work with UNDRIP and in and around international policy, the policy level, as well as your own mob down there on the Gold Coast. What does a process like this review period offer for First Nations communities? Is there any sort of structural opportunity that we can leverage to be able to enhance our ability to be able to take further control of of water across the basin, Maddie?
Thanks, Troy. Yeah, there's a huge opportunity with this basin review. I want to see Indigenous governance valued and respected. And I believe when referring to UNDRIP, that can be as easy as upholding FPIC, free, prior and informed consent, when dealing with and working with Aboriginal communities. So free meaning that communities aren't forced or intimidated or coerced. Prior meaning we have sufficient time to consider decisions. We're informed through accessible information that's comprehensible, and that we give our consent or we withhold that consent based on what is best for our communities. UNDRIP Article 32.2 again clearly outlines this right and standard, and I believe that it doesn't necessarily have to come from a national level, because at the moment we don't have a national UNDRIP framework, but it can be up to individuals, it can be up to independent businesses, it can be up to government departments to really embrace FPIC, and I think that's a real opportunity. I also believe that going back, it's a common thread, having our authority valued and included. So recognition is one step, but the next step is that authority being included through shared decision making. So when referring to UNDRIP, it encompasses all of it. It's just a matter of the systems and the systemic barriers being broken down and reformed, and us having a seat at the table.
Hey, Maddie, thank you so much. And on the structural barriers that are in place, Jules, how do we overcome those barriers, and how do we seize the opportunity that's available to us, and we don't let it pass, and progress into a period where we're just reproducing the earlier sort of disadvantages that Basin nations are facing. So how do we target these structural barriers that are in place?
Yeah, it comes down to, I think it's a continuum, right? And we can see that there's a recognition and acknowledgement piece. And it depends on language and it depends on how you understand it. But for me, you have recognizing and and acknowledgement, you have inclusion, and then you have authoritative positions. I think inclusion and having a seat at the table is a great thing, but if you're just there purely in a tokenistic manner, it's not going to do anything. So that position at the table needs to have authority, and it needs to be based in sovereignty and as rights holders. So we have to move from this shift from participation and engagement, which is heavily the language that is used in the review. And we also see it in other policy documents, such as closing the gap. And we know that closing the gap hasn't been very successful, and they use the same language. So we need to make sure that the language is clear and that it is operationalized and it is given some form of authority to do things. We need to move to formal authority rather than advisory status. And having a seat at the table means the seat at the table where the decisions are actually made, not somewhere along the line, because there is that consultative period where people are brought in and their voices are quote unquote elevated, but where do they go from there? So we need to be really cautious of the language that's being used, but we also need to see action. So how are we going to do it? We can put pretty words on paper, but we need to see action. And that comes from authoritative positions of power within decision-making structures. So if we don't do that, though, we risk a level of performative inclusion, which I feel that, is something that governments and organizations and authorities do, and they don't necessarily do it with that intent, but it does become like that. So we need Indigenous First Nations people to be able to participate, to meaningfully influence outcomes and policies and decisions, rather than just having voices, quote unquote, elevated and being included for the sake of inclusion.
Excellent, Jules. Thank you. As Uncle Dale sort of reiterated before, water is inseparable from the economic fallout and the cascading impacts that are felt right across the basin, particularly at the grassroots level for communities, particularly who are out in the regions. Sam, could I ask you just a final question in terms of the economic link to water? So we're talking about the structural barriers that are in place. So if we're thinking ahead to seize the opportunity that's available to us through this basin plan review, what governance shift would be necessary for nations to be able to fully grasp and take hold of a sustainable water-based economies across the basin?
I mean, if they're at the tables where the decision is being made, then they're privy to the actions that are happening and the opportunities that are coming across the table. I think at the moment, when a group of people has a lot of knowledge and insight, but doesn't necessarily have access to the knowledge and information about what's happening, there's a massive disconnect and power imbalance. I don't think I have anything more insightful to add than the previous panel members, because they're pretty much across it. But when it comes to the economic side of it, I just want to say, you may have all the best ideas in the world about how to generate money off of the land that we live on, and you wouldn't be the first. There's been a lot of people that have come to Australia here to make money, right? But those people have not been Indigenous people. So every single person that's come here and profited off this land has done so at the expense of Indigenous people's well-being. So I think now it's time to burn the monopoly board and start again, and don't be afraid to take risks and try new things. You do not need to do things in the way that they have been done before. I would encourage you to be brave and step out of those tired old models and try things differently. Yeah, that's all my advice to you. Thanks, Troy.
Such powerful words, Sam. That's wonderful. I see we've got a question in the Q&A from Max, and we'll come back to that just after this in a moment there, Max. Anybody else has any questions or comments for the panel, please send them through. We've got some minutes remaining in this webinar, so we'd love to hear from you. Uncle Dale, I'll come to you in a sec. I'll just ask Jeff one question in relation to his experiences with working at the interface between engagement with nations. So from your experience, Jeff, what's the tenor from communities? So what are communities thinking in terms of a practical change? Whether that's part of the review process, part of the Basin Plan review process, or perhaps more broadly, what is the key, the key things that communities are asking for in terms of practical change on the ground?
Yeah, for them to be in a position where they're informed prior to things happening, not afterwards. So having access to water and being able to get past the locked gate, to have a real seat at the table where all voices are on the same level, not some elevated and others spoken over. That if land is returned, you also get access to the water that goes with it. And I was sort of thinking, like, an auntie was telling me recently of all the steps that she had to take to enable her to get water on country for a cultural event, just so that they could do weaving with a women's retreat. The list was a mile long, and most would give up. So it needs to be workable. And the other thing that, and Troy, you've heard this as well, is people need access to water that they can drink, they can eat what comes from it, and if they're in the water, they don't get sick. So they're just a couple of things that I've heard.
Well, it's so important, and we hear time and time again when we're traveling across the basin that the government are using different threshold levels to be able to measure water quality. When, as Jeff said, our people use three simple metrics: can you drink it? Can you drink the water? Can you eat from what comes from it? And can you swim in it? And unfortunately, most of that water across the basin fails to pass that cultural threshold for our people. Uncle Dale, you had your hand up, and then I'll go to Jules.
Yep, just going on along those lines of corporations and economics, about 10 years ago, they reset the parameters and red tape on applying for an Aboriginal or Indigenous corporation. The red tape you have to go through to set up a corporation based on the corporate world, to do that. And that's causing problems for a lot of our communities as well, setting up. The government red tape to set up a business or an Indigenous corporation based on their parameters is ridiculous. And it's causing problems out in our communities to do it. I just thought I'd raise that as well. That's one of the problems we have with water, as you just pointed out, Jeff.
Removing the red tape and streamlining the processes to make it more accessible to community. Such a good point, Uncle Dale. Jules?
Yeah, I just wanted to add two points, both that come from in a past life I was a teacher. I've worked in a discrete Indigenous community, not in the Basin, but I worked in Queensland in a discrete community where the water was not drinkable. I had a wage, had a salary, I paid $17 a fortnight in rent, being a teacher, and I had to buy bottled water. The question comes to mind, if water is not drinkable, and it is in discrete communities or communities where there is lower socioeconomic people, how do people afford it? Particularly in this day and age where the cost of living is really high, being able to go to the shop and buy bottled water is a luxury, and sometimes we forget that. So that's just one point that I wanted to make around that. And the other thing that comes from my teaching background is a saying that we used to say, and it was, what's good for First Nations students is good for all students. So in this context, what is good for First Nations people is good for all people. So what First Nation people advocate will have flow-on effects for everybody in the community. So it's not a zero-sum game. It's something where if you understand our culture, you understand that we are trying to ensure continuity for future generations. We don't shut it off at different races. We think about the future. So if what is good for First Nations people, and if we can invest in First Nations peoples and knowledges and ways of being, it's going to benefit everybody and everybody in the community.
Really good insight, Julie. Thank you for that. So we're getting close to the end of our webinar. I'll call upon our panel just to think of some final thoughts to share with the group and for those who engage with the recording once we finish our webinar. I'll just turn to Max's question here in the Q&A. So Max says, thanks for the important yarn so far. Has the team identified any significant research/knowledge gaps that could support more effective negotiation processes between Indigenous nations and the MDBA regarding water rights and allocations? Excellent question, Max. I guess I can take this one. In the First Nations research program, we're really close to beginning a project on First Nations water policy, particularly looking at the role of native title across the basin and perhaps the revised or the renewed role of native title and what that could sort of mean for broadening of First Nations water rights and allocations. So MDBAs will be one of our industry partners for that one, as well as the Queensland Department of Environment, Tourism, Science and Innovation. So I guess in some ways we're dealing with the water rights and the allocations. I guess the point that you raise in relation to effective negotiation processes perhaps could be a focus of future works moving forward. Couple of minutes left now, panel. Sam, you got your hands up? Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Troy, I've just been working on a project with Bond University, a business school, and we've developed a model for negotiation. So we call it relational resonance and negotiation. I can give you guys a quick little peek into it if you want.
That'd be good, yeah, excellent. And a link to be able to share with the group as well.
It's not published yet. We're working on publishing it. So I'm just trying to bring it up. Sorry. I'm just going to mute myself while I find it. All right.
It's okay. Yeah, no problems. All right. So while Sam finds out, any final thoughts to share with the group? Julie, we'll go to you first, and then Maddie.
Thanks, Troy. I just think that it's a huge ecosystem of history and things intertwining with itself. And I think today a key takeaway listening to everybody is that you really have to understand the country that you're on and the history that is there. You also have to understand the historical context as to why we may have been excluded. I think that for structural change, we really need to move to more authoritative positions in decision making. We need to move away from, for lack of a better word, airy-fairy, nice on paper positions. If we say we're going to do something, it needs to be exercised, and you need to understand how. One really key thing is that when there are funding constraints, we need to make sure that First Nations governance or rights or programs are not the first to be cut. Often they're seen as not as important as other things, but as I mentioned before, what is good for First Nations people is good for all people. So we need to make sure that that funding is not destabilized or taken away, and that it is continually there, and that First Nations people within those governance structures have their voices heard, and that they are at the key decision-making tables, not the ones that are sitting out in orbit.
Appreciate it, Jules. Maddie, and then I'll come to Sam.
Thanks, Troy. I'll finish by saying that I just really want to see our people empowered so we can exercise our basic Indigenous human rights. And I think the Basin Plan review provides a perfect opportunity to enable that. And I will reiterate what Julie has said. And when Indigenous peoples are valued, when we're respected, and when we're centred, all peoples benefit.
Appreciate it, Maddie. Samantha?
Yep, I found it now. I'll share it with you all. We did 2 versions of this, and this was all done by the voices and perspective of Indigenous women in business. And we did it with the dilly bag, because you have a really strong foundation and you build out from there. And these are all the things that were very relevant to the Indigenous business women to be successful and to be aware of as they go into negotiation. So as part of this, we've also created a non-Indigenous teaching device. And this is here, relational resonance and negotiation. And these are the sorts of things that, as a non-Indigenous person going to negotiate with an Indigenous organisation or individual, the kinds of questions you should be asking yourself and considering before you go to negotiation. Because Indigenous negotiation is not around the BATNA. For those of you who are familiar with those sorts of tools will not come into play. Yes, you need to be aware of them, but these things are much more important in that negotiation. So hopefully that helps. Sorry.
Appreciate it. And Sam, once it's available, how can we provide that through the CRC?
So we're going to publish that. We're in the process of doing that. And once it's done, I can share it with you, Troy, and you can share it with whoever's interested.
At the network. Look, we realise we're over time. This is a First Nations panel. We're never ever going to run on time, so we understand time is precious. If anybody needs to push away, no hard feelings. But it's important for us to get final thoughts from all of our panel members. So I'll go to Uncle Dale next. Uncle Dale, final thoughts to be able to share with the group. You're on mute, Uncle.
Sorry. Yeah, I like what Julie pointed out too, and it was much the same as my grandfather said. We need to walk together. The way we look after the country, it's for the good of everybody, not just about corporates. People don't realise in this country, our what we call a constitution, corporations have more rights than people in our constitution, and we need to come together as people and look after this country so it'll look after us. And the waterways are one of them. I'm here at Nango. You can't drink the water here at Nango. You have to go and buy it from the shops. anyway, that's my thoughts. We need to walk together and promote us, and listen to what we've got to say about this country and how to manage it.
It's a shared problem, isn't it? Or is it a shared resource? Water, land, country, people. We're all in it together. We've got to walk together. We've got to collaborate. We've got to cooperate. It's important for all of us to move in the same direction. Jeff, final
Yeah,
thoughts, my friend.
yeah. I reckon the whole basin misses out if we're not drawing on the full depths of knowledge and long-term stewardship that we bring, and it has a real dramatic consequence for the environment and community outcomes. So the risk is if we stay in the same path, slow progress, limited outcomes, and ongoing decline, it's going to be catastrophic for the whole basin.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you to all of our panel members today. And noticing a bit of a pattern occurring across the chat, that if anybody wants to reach out and get in contact with First Nations Research Program or any members of our panel, please do so. You can find our contact details online. I put my email in the chat, so please don't hesitate to reach out and keep the conversation going. I think to reiterate all of our panel members' thoughts and sentiments is that it's important for us to walk together. It's a critical opportunity we have in front of us, and I think we all have to be sick and tired of the status quo, and we've got to actually be fed up and push for the opportunity to be able to create a new space for a new basin and a new water management structure. The opportunities in front of us, and I think we all miss out, as Jeffrey says, if First Nations people continue to be second-class citizens across their own water countries. And it's up to us. It's on us, and the time is now. So please take the opportunity to be able to influence in your own network, across your own networks, and see if there's opportunities to be able to increase the awareness and the discussion in and around First Nations water rights and the opportunities for Aboriginal people to actually have a seat at the table, governance table. Thank you for joining us today. This is the last webinar, I believe, across the CRC. Looking forward to keeping the conversation going offline. Please reach out and get in contact with us if there's anything urgent or pressing. Thank you very much, and thank you again to all of our panel members. It's a wonderful session, great yarn. Thank you.